Hi, Kurt. Third conversation I think we're having.
Third or fourth?
I have no idea.
It's been a while though. I think we did
yeah.
two pretty close, and then I think we did one 6 months later. And I bet we haven't had a conversation in 9 months or more.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the reason I reached out to you, and I just told you that a few seconds ago, but so to set the setting also for people listening, is I find that, so I'm kind of following BSV and Bitcoin as a non-techie, non-financial person who's actually more in the field of psychology. And I find that for me, it seems like right now Bitcoin and BSV is in this really fascinating psychological spot where hopes have been disappointed. Kind of, I think, ideas how people had, oh yeah, this is how it's going to continue, and then none of those came to fruition. And and I find that it's this super interesting psychological point, and I would love to talk about that and also see what does it ask of people. Like that would be the question I'm with here.
Brilliant. I mean, I can just free talk, or you can break it into smaller questions if you like.
So I imagine I'll just throw it on your side, and then we'll figure out what the smaller questions are, because I don't know them yet.
Sure. So it's interesting. Going back to, talking about disappointment, right? Mm-hmm. For me, so I've had a really rough month or two myself. I've had a really rough week, actually. I don't know if you can see my eyes a little bit of I got kind of a black eye. Mm-hmm. So I do martial arts is big part of my life. I ate a knee really bad like a week ago. Happens occasionally. It's really had 3 black eyes in my life from doing just jujitsu, but this was one of them. But it turned into like a weird infection also. Like it swelled the way I'd expected to, but then it became sort of weepy and got really goofy. So maybe the guy's knee was dirty or whatever.
I mean, BJJ spaces are known to have one or two pathogens in them.
Yep.
Maybe.
Yeah, and I definitely caught one of them. So I've been putting antibiotics in my eye. It's got my whole face kind of swollen. And then I went to the dentist, and now I've got a couple of fillings that didn't go very well. So old ones. These were from 20 years ago, and I had to have them redone. For whatever reason, one tooth all the way in the back of my mouth, no matter how much Novocaine he would put in it, it wouldn't get all the way numb. So I had to have like a cowboy dentistry experience where I'm like, putting permanent hand marks on the chair. So all that to say, it's a little bit of a allegory for what it's been like to be a BSV person, to have these things that they matter, like your physical fitness or having a physical challenge, or that kind of thing is a really good thing in my opinion for people to go through. But you get damaged, right? It's just like anybody, you get hurt doing things that are pushing. And then just maintenance, just going through the motion. Like I can't just ignore my teeth because it hurts, right? Like this is a path.
There's nothing worse than toothaches.
There really aren't. I've had a bad tooth pulled in the past, and the 3 or 4 days between deciding it needed to be pulled and actually getting it done was like, like I understand why people want like assisted suicides. Like it's in your head. Like there's nothing like something being in your head throbbing, just the whole thing, just outrageous.
And also this interesting experience. I once pulled a tooth myself because I was at the dentist, but I couldn't handle the kind of the motion of it, so the only way I could deal with it was doing it myself. But
it's funny.
That was easier for me to take than having somebody else do it.
Mine actually, I was in a similar situation. It was like, because I'm sitting in bed on painkillers and it's still just like is killing me, right? So I'm like sucking on it, like seeing if I can get it, like maybe I can pull it out myself. And then I came to realize that doing that actually made it feel better for a few minutes, but then the throb would come back to, like, it was essentially, it was abscessed, and so it would refill and just terrible experience. But I survived it, and that's key. And so for me, like thinking about BSV is the same thing, right? The pitch deck version of BSV is, hey man, there's $20 trillion broadcast across the world as data every day. It's a trillion megabytes. It's there's 3 million emails a second go across the internet. 80% of it or something like that is spam. Like, we don't even read it. We hate it. It's this massive resource suck. Data packets, like there's the missing 402 aspect of the internet where there's supposed to be an integrated payments protocol and all these things. So if you look at the 1-pager or the 3-pager version of all the problems in the world that BSV can solve, and can solve pretty exclusively, by the way, it's like, oh, this is easy. This is no problem here, right? Like, this is the meme of that dude from Shark Tank, like, invest, and like that's great. But then you get to the fine print. And the fine print is usually humans, right? So, but it's a few different factions. It's this concept that BSV and Craig Wright are intrinsically intertwined, which I think is unfair, by the way. But then also the baggage from the Bitcoin civil war and all these other things, where I've come to realize some small subcontext of what it must be like to be a native on a conquered land, and to say, man, for 10,000 years my ancestors had this, and somehow we lost it to these colonist pricks, just because they were more shrewd, more Machiavellian, right? And so, and I have some Native American friends, and I have some people that were, first people in other countries, and they share their stories. And I've always had kind of a dismissive view of it, where it's like, well, I mean, that's just evolution. That's how things work. This is, like, there's a reason why some species thrive and others don't, and same with other groups of people. And why are Aboriginal people in Australia unchanged for 60,000 years, but it took British people 2,000 years to go from grass huts to all of this, like, export the English way, and which even you and I are sort of part of. Like you speak English even though you're not,
it right now.
right?
Yes.
and that's an incredible example. Whereas a language, I believe the most complex language to learn in the world is Navajo. I think it's Navajo, which is a nearly extinct tribe in the western part of the United States. Really, 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 really complex ancient language with incredible syntax, and like, there's no rules to it. Just everything is its own thing. So like, there's no continuity to the rule set in Navajo. So there's not a rule to learn. You either learn it or you don't. To the point where most Navajo people today do not speak Navajo, because it's so impractical, and why would you learn it in the first place? And so, being a BSVer, it's the same thing. It's we have this beautiful vision, like all these things, all these problems that could be solved, all this stuff that needs a solution. And that's the funny thing, is when we talk about the problems of like spam and identity, and your data being scraped for some unknown purpose that benefits Mark Zuckerberg somehow, and these kind of things. And BSV has very practical solutions to these problems, and they exist today. They're not even roadmap items. It would literally be if somebody at Facebook Meta were to say, you know what, we'll just use a private key based protocol for identity attestation and all these other things. Like, they could just implement it. They could have it implemented in 3 months, because the base technology is there, it's tested, it's stable, and it doesn't exist. And the reason it doesn't exist is all the entrenched nonsense and all the people that are making money and staying in power over the inefficiencies of the system. And so I think this was the major miscalculation that I made, and that a lot of us made 5 years ago about big block Bitcoin generally, is that, well, Bitcoin was designed to solve these problems. And if we give people this solution that lowers cost and gives people greater access and control of their identity and all these other things, their wealth and payments, I mean, how does it not win, right? And then you realize, oh man, there's trillions of dollars of power sitting in the hands of gatekeepers. Like, we're talking about eliminating third parties because it sounds great, but the reason it sounds great is because third parties are very powerful by being gatekeepers. Mm-hmm. And so now we've had to obviously recalibrate any number of things, both strategically, coming up with roadmap items for adoption. I've long said, one thing I still have yet to see a whole lot of people try to do is like actual cold call business development, that kind of thing. You know, who's calling Meta, right? I mean, we'll tweet about it and that, but is anybody actually calling Facebook and saying, hey, by the way, we have the solution and this and that, we could sell it to you?
It's every imaginable Meta number.
Right. And like, that's the kind of thing that would have been very obvious 20 years ago for some new technology. I mean, like, look at the AOL people are like, well, I guess we could mail everyone on Earth a disk, and they did it.
But what I find really fascinating when I listen to you seems to be the miscalculation is not necessarily a miscalculation or a misunderstanding of the tech. It's a misunderstanding of the human nature connected to the tech, which actually, from my field, which is like working with people on their psychological struggles, but also kind of visions. I think one huge element in that is helping people develop in some very key places of their life a realistic perspective of humans, and a realistic perspective of humans includes the beauty, but it also includes all of the darkness, the malevolence, the reality that we're all always hunting and fighting over status, and that our status is more important than almost anything else in our life. And if our status depends on the fact that I am the gatekeeper right here, then I will put everything behind keeping this position.
Yeah.
Even though in a different system that I don't know yet, I might have a much better position, and there might be a whole lot of solutions to problems I have now. I know that I have this status, so I better cling on to it.
Right. And it's fascinating. It's a really interesting thing. Like, I think of the things that influence my thinking generally, like a movie like Braveheart, for example. There's a big influence on the way that I think about everything. But then you actually read the real history of William Wallace, and you realize, yeah, the story was roughly true that we saw. However, the key part that was left out of that movie is that rather than fighting to the bitter end, and he was executed ultimately, but part of why his victory was secured is that he did actually take a role as a lord in the system. So he fought. He was a rebel to a point, but he did comply and reintegrate with the system after the key part of his point was made, and then it was a reintegration and a compromise in order to to make it work. And
when he had the leverage to negotiate.
Yes, but the way the story is told, like, that's not the version you're going to tell to your kids. Like, well, I was a rebel and this and that, but you're going to tell your kid like, I fought to the bitter end, right? That's my reputation. But in reality, yeah, I went to the back room, I took the bribe. We all agreed that PR would tell it this way because it makes us all look better and whatever. And so there's a part of me that has to wonder, is there a way to be truly timelessly victorious without compromising in some big way with the existing system? Because this is where I think Bitcoin itself really, really struggles. And I think it's all versions. It's the BTC people, the BCH people, the BSV people, all do the same thing. The BTC people are, be your own bank.
They basically are the rebel story.
Yes.
The BTC story is the rebel story.
Right. Yeah.
So, that would be the archetype there.
Yeah, but to the nth degree. However, their entire roadmap and all their infrastructure and all their stuff, it's been corporate controlled for at least 7 years. I mean, it's every significant developer in Bitcoin, in BTC Bitcoin, is tangentially connected to companies like New York Life, MasterCard, and all these other things, So after being, we're these anarchist separatists, we're building this entirely new society, citadels in space, this whole thing, this whole grand vision, but it's all crap. It's all made up.
Yeah,
It's completely fake.
It doesn't correlate with what's actually going on and where the influence and money is actually coming from.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so you look at that and you say, well, if they win, like, what changes? Does it become Bitcoin asterisk, a MasterCard company? or is it, do they actually do they influence things to come there? I haven't really seen anybody go the direction of Bitcoin in a massive correlatory or a correlative sense at all. Like I go to Bitcoin 2022 and the entire thing is, hey, welcome to Bitcoin 22, brought to you by Cash App, and they're giving me stickers with corporate copyright logos on them and stuff. And I'm like, okay, so you're pretending you're rebellious, which is, I mean, you see this everywhere. You've seen this with social movements and everything. You go to the Martin Luther King a monument in Washington, D.C., and it's the same thing. It's, here's Martin Luther King in the government capitol and brought to you by, whatever the sponsors are of the monument at this point in time. And I'm sitting here and thinking, like, man, the real Martin Luther King would have hated all of this. Every bit of it would have pissed him off. But here it is. We get the sanitized version. We get the tour guide explaining why he's a hero.
So on a psychological level, and this is something I've actually thought about, especially in the past weeks. It's like, there is the story I can tell myself if I'm in BTC. It's like, I am the rebel and I'm fighting the system.
Yeah.
But at the same time, my sense, especially when I look at basically all the big names that you can listen to, they're all either they've gotten rich because Bitcoin has gone up massively, so they have a massive vested interest there, or they're sponsored. So they all have like a big monetary interest, but they have the other story they can tell. But if we take kind of BTC as the rebel story, what would be the BSV story that BSV has told so far? Like, what's the archetype there?
So, I mean, there's a few. For me, it's funny. I always draw either religious analogies or Star Wars analogies. So,
can't go wrong with either, huh?
Right? Yeah, they both work. So, but the funny thing with BSV is, it's very much like, I'll go with the church analogy because it's a little more practical. There are many factions of people who think they're Bitcoiners. And I may have even said this on other times we spoke, that if you talk to a Calvinist or a Lutheran or a whatever, Presbyterian or a Methodist versus a Roman Catholic, they would all say to themselves, we're the real Christians. The other ones maybe aren't, because either everybody's breaking some fundamental rule of Christianity in the opinions of everyone else, right? And so that's fine. But truly, Christianity is itself a derivation of Judaism. And so if you go back to Hebrew history, there was about a 2-ish 100-year period. Depends who you ask. If you ask the Catholics, there was no gray area. But historically, you can look at it and say, okay, for the first 200 to 400 years, it was unclear whether followers of Jesus Christ were a sect of Judaism or if they were a separate religion entirely. And the reason is they share all this other parentage. They share the Genesis, for example, and much like Bitcoin, like, well, this is our common shared history. We have the same creator. We have the same idols up to a certain point, and all these other things. So we have all this commonality.
In all of these, back to the same text saying, and that's why we're Bitcoin. Yeah,
exactly. And so then it gets to a certain point where you're not even sure when you stopped being allies completely, or you stopped being the same religion even. And a lot of it has to do when it was systematized. But for BSV, I treat BSV as I think of it a lot like the Protestant Reformation. And the reason for that is, so there was a period when the Catholic Church went from being a plucky startup itself to being essentially the like, you weren't allowed to become a king without the Pope's anointment. And that was a very, very complicated thing, both religiously and legally. And there's a lot of intertwining stuff that I think a lot of people would look back and say, I'm not even sure how this happened, but the Pope has an army now, and if you don't pay taxes to it, they can kill you. And so this is a problem. But when the Protestant Reformation started in the early 1500s, it was preceded by, and this is why I like it for the BSV analogy, is that the Protestant Reformation wasn't just one thing. It wasn't just dissatisfaction with the church. It was a dissatisfaction with the church, but the whole of European culture and the way that it had gone, because of a technological revolution. And that technological revolution was
the printing press.
The printing press. There was a big revolution in printing that made it, the cost of printing a book just dropped precipitously over the course of just a few years. And so a book that would have cost you 2 months' salary 5 years ago, you can now go buy on a day's wages, and now you can read the Bible for yourself in your native tongue, for example. And then all of a sudden it gives people the ability to own their own data, right? So you don't have to go to church on Sunday and listen to your priest read the Bible in Latin, which is a language you don't really speak, and then give you his interpretation of what he has just read. You can take the thing home, you can study it how you want, you can underline it, you can reference, and then, okay, hey, I actually need to research what this word even actually means. And then all of a sudden we get this explosion out of Western Europe of creativity. And I mean, we still in the US call it the Protestant work ethic, because everybody that moved to the entire eastern half of the United States were Protestant refugees initially. And so they came here and were like, hey, cool, a place where we can be Christians and build the world that we want to build. And and we've seen what that's become over the last 300-ish years now, is that, oh, interesting, if you give people something to unite with and a historical understanding of things and the ability to then plan their own destiny based on a good amount of information, the world becomes all of these new kinds of productive and all this other stuff. And so BSV,
if I follow you with that archetype, I can totally get how the rebel archetype is way more appealing. That's a much simpler story. It's a much simpler picture of like, we are against the bad people, so stay with us. And the others are like, well, it's complicated and you got to do your own research and there's this and then, so it's way more complex and nuanced.
It is, but it's a both and, because here's the thing: the word Protestant comes from the word to protest. So it is, they saw themselves initially as protesting Catholics, like we are still Catholic, we are protesting the things we disagree with. So for a long time, actually, similarly to the beginning of Christianity and its split from Judaism, they also didn't see themselves as split, but the quote unquote Orthodox Catholics did. And then it's just, there's all kinds of politics there too. But BSV, the reason I really, really like this analogy is that BSV is trying to take that step. It's doing the same thing. It's saying, okay, data is in silos again. The most important and the most valuable data is in places that we cannot understand. We can't translate it. We can't access it unless we have all this corporate access. But even if we got it, we can't be the ones to leak it, or we'll end up in prison or some of these other things. And so what BSV does is it allows that new system to be built that gives the world access to that next step. And so what happens when more information, and not just more, it is more aggregate, more raw data, but also filtering by total value and value as defined by proof of work and all these other things, all these systems that can be built to compete to get the best data at the same time. So just like everything else, take everything you can know in the world, which are their whole new engineering problems, how to do all of that then. For sure, absolutely. Yeah. But you give it to people and you make them compete to filter it the best. And whoever filters it the best, not only do they get very wealthy, but we all get smarter because it allows us to tune out. This is what our brains do. Like, our brains are picking out all kinds of crazy information everywhere all the time, but our brain decides, hey, you need to focus on driving, eating, doing whatever it is you do. So imagine if we could take more information than just our brain. We can take everyone's brains and all the digital brains and make them focus, make them filter better. What are the most productive things to do, the most valuable things to do? And that can be determined by a competitive consensus on all information. And so I see that as a gigantic step in human evolution. But like I said, this is in stark rebellion to the fact that the BTC people and all that, like MasterCard and Facebook and all these people, which incidentally have coalesced into COPA to sue Satoshi Nakamoto and try to kill BSV. They want that data in a silo. If that data is liberated, we don't need any of them. They need us to need them, in much the same way that the Protestant Reformation led to generations of war and all these other things over people's power. I think it's going to look a lot the same way. And I think we should have probably predicted that we would have quite a bit more backlash initially, but we were naive and optimistic a few years ago. And I think we're quite a bit less so today.
So if I try to maybe concretize the analogy into kind of movie scripts, there is the rebel movie script, and the Protestant Revolution is not that much of a well-known movie script, but
Sure.
But maybe it's actually it's kind of the small group that comes together not to rebel but to better the world. Like, it would be the small group of scientists that work in secret on something or something like that. That's kind of or not even in secret, but that work while they're overlooked. Like, that might be the archetype more of the BSV.
So, well, yeah, and this is what I like about the Star Wars analogy, is that both sides think they're right. I mean, Darth Vader was not overtly evil. His goal wasn't to harm people. His goal was to bring balance to the Force in the way that he did, but it was to save the Republic. It was to save his wife. He had his own twisted motives. He gave into what is an allegory for a fascistic government. There's a reason why the bad guys in Star Wars are all dressed like Nazis and jackboots and things. Like, they're painting it pretty thick in those movies. But then you have this rebellion of people that are, relatively normal people that don't want to be governed unfairly. They were willing to be governed. They were happy to be in the Republic, but they didn't want to be in the Empire. And the Empire just wanted to keep consuming resources and all these other things, which is what BTC is. BTC is about, we're just going to absorb all the value in the universe. And if you are holding coins, you're going to be the ruling class. And if you are not holding coins, you are going to be a permanent serf class forever. And so, and that's it. That's the hierarchy of the universe going forward, because they don't believe in inflation and bubbles and these things as a way to create new kinds of wealth, which I think a lot of people don't realize when you get into Austrian economics and Keynesian economics and some of these things that everybody acts like they understand. The BTC people aren't Austrian. Austrian people believe in velocity of money and all these other things. BTC people do not. They believe in locking up assets and keeping them forever. They believe that the proof of work system of Bitcoin should become a proof of stake system culturally, where I am a 10 BTC person, and that puts me in a caste that can't be broken out of. And so,
which again, if you tell that to BTC people, they will say no. But at the same time, I actually would agree with you also when I look at how the Lightning Network and all of those are built. Like, the Lightning Network is, I don't even think it's a layer 2. It's like a kind of its own thing that could be linked to anything if it worked.
It's a tangential payments network. Yeah.
So yeah, I can get that. So maybe even taking the Protestant analogy one step further. So the change that came from the Protestant Revolution was not an institutional change. It wasn't like the Catholic Church then said, oh yeah, damn, you're right. We change, which would be like Google saying, oh yeah, you're right, our business model is bad, we will change. It was individual people, and then around those people, growing communities that got together and saw different options. Those were often based on an incredible impetus on education, which is something that I find really interesting when I talk to different people, where I often see a massive gap between actual knowledge, for instance, of the white paper, between BSVlers and BTClers. Yeah. So the actual knowledge is often different. So education and work. Yeah. And where I imagine that actually the thing that it needs to come down to is people using BSV, not because it's BSV, but because they can do awesome shit with it. And then other people being like, whoa, that seems like a really good idea. How do I join that? Yep. Like so it isn't we can go to the big institutions and everything will change from there. It has to be grassroots, bottom up.
Yeah. Those are real movements. There's a reason why the Catholic Church today, they're known for having lots of children. Like, they don't use birth control. They believe it is bad, but that wasn't always the case. Catholics did not used to breed in such ways. It's actually a reaction to the Protestant Reformation, because they saw it as an imperative when they had a good idea and realized, hey, our culture is important, but it's small. They made the decision, well, we need to breed more. And then so we've had that as a part. So it's hard work, but it's also breeding your ideas, and that can be done horizontally, which would be to, I educate someone who I know, he educates someone who he knows. But there's also hey, I'm capable of probably bringing another 10 people into the world. And so those would be 10 more people that would more than likely have the same ideas, and you push them out that way too. And so it's an interesting way to try to solve a cultural problem, but that really is it. Like the tech, and this can mean the technology, or it can mean the information about the technology, is fundamentally informed by a culture. A cursed culture will never create a blessed thing, essentially. And so I think it's important that from the Protestant Reformation, there was the ethic of hard work, family, exploration, and truly, it also opened up what we think of as the scientific revolution and a bunch of these things. So free thought made a more robust church, but it also bred atheism and agnosticism and a lot of the things that became the cultural the cultural other, like the things that I think a Christian at the era would have said, oh shoot, a third of the global population is going to be non-Christian as a product of these ideas that we have come up with. Like that's a curious derivation there, but it's but I think that's also important, is that it was the freedom to choose. It was this freedom to, here's as much information as we can give you. We're not masking it. We're not dipping it in milk for you or anything. It's, you get to chew on it and you do what you want with it. And a certain portion of people are like, hey, great, I'm going to be a Lutheran or a Presbyterian or something. And other people said, oh, okay, there is no God. I'm going to be a whatever. I'm going to be a theater major, or I'm going to be a doctor, or I'm going to be some other thing. Right. And so there's a lot of intrigue as to spillover benefits and unplanned for consequences and things that come of these things too. But I would argue that those are also predicates of what makes a free market a good thing. Like these are good things to explore. Like these are all independent experiments in culture, and we get to prove them out also over time. And so I guess it's a little bit meandering, but I think this is a journey for Bitcoin that has needed to happen. This was always going to happen. And it's important to learn those lessons from history. The history is there, and we can say, well, what worked short term and what worked long term, and how can we apply the good things to us? We're a small group. We are not even 1% of the size of the BTC, hash power and infrastructure and investment, and maybe culture, or total number of fans, like that kind of thing. But like you said, our understanding is different. I would argue that it's deeper. It's much more committed. It's a commitment to the truth. It is almost a lust for the truth. Frankly, it's this, like, what did Satoshi mean with every single word? Like, what can we extrapolate out of? Maybe there's a sentence he spoke that we've been ignoring for 13 years. And if we just read it one more time, that it would express itself in a way that would give me a eureka moment, and those kind of things. And that's important.
I mean, for me also, in me researching, when I got into the Bitcoin question and I ran across BSV, and whenever somebody tells me something is a scam, I'm like, oh, I get interested, because I find that. But for me, the big conversations that Craig Wright had with both Charles X. What's the
Ryan
X Charles the other way, and so all of those conversations, like, for me, that was one of the bigger convincers that there must be something here, because of the depth of how one small thing could be expanded, which is something I haven't seen anywhere else. And I don't only have that with him, but also with listening to Brandon Lee, listening to those people, like, that there is a depth of understanding, both in the technical, where it doesn't turn into kind of platitudes, which is how I often perceive the BTC. It's like, and that is why we need to do these things so that we can stay censorship resistant. Where I'm like, I've heard that 100 times now. Like, thank you very much.
It's axioms. They're bumper stickers.
Yeah. But if we follow this analogy of, so we're in the Protestant Revolution, and we've understood by now that the Catholic Church isn't going to change. What does that ask of the people in the space?
It's a good question. And so it's funny, because we get so embroiled in our Bitcoin politics that we forget that there's this whole other broader world that we were intended to disrupt. And so rather than, and I think there's a place for debate, academic debate among a great Protestant and a great Catholic thinker, for example, is very fun to watch, but also not particularly broad in its appeal to the world. What we should be doing is the missionary work. And so by missionary work, I mean, we could be going to local businesses, some large, some small. We can be explaining to people, just for example, the fact that Bitcoin is a triple entry accounting system and that nobody's really done much with it. But if you were to give a lunch seminar to the local, pick 5 local accounting firms and tell them to come in, like, hey, I'll provide you bagels and coffee and whatever. Show up. I'm going to give a 3-hour presentation about how accounting, like how triple entry accounting can be implemented using Bitcoin as a predicate technology to change the way that you do your books over the next 20 years. I'm not selling you anything. I just want you to see what's possible. And you get people's minds turning. And it's the exact kind of thing that, a missionary would do if they're if let's just say you're a Catholic missionary and you go to some land where, well, they don't speak the language, they don't have the Bible, they don't have any context for anything. I'm going to explain to them why the Catholic way of life is a good thing. And Protestants do this too. I've done a bit of missionary work myself in my life. And to do that and to see someone, to explain to somebody like, well, there's a reason why you keep getting sick. And it's not because there's evil spirits in the water. It's because you need to sterilize it and all of this. Like, I'm going to teach you some very practical things to make your life better. But I'm also going to explain to you that the reason why I'm doing it is because I think that it's important for me to spread my good ideas. But the reason why I believe my ideas are good is based on some other fundamental thing. And that comes from the Bible. And if you're interested in reading it, if you like anything about the way that I am, this is one of the pillars of why I am the way that I am, and you might appreciate it. And so that kind of thing is the exact same concept with Bitcoin. It shouldn't just be like, hey man, Bitcoin's going to change the world. You need to buy some and sit on it and wait. I want to teach someone, hey, here's how Bitcoin can very practically reduce cost or increase efficiency in some aspect of your life or business. And by the way, it only works in this version of Bitcoin, BSV, which is the one that I like. Read the white paper. I'm Kurt. Here's my card. If you want me to connect you to somebody to help you implement some of these things, I'm happy to do that. And so I think that that's a crucial part of it. I think that's what differentiates BSV. BSV grows because it is useful, as opposed to BTC, which grows because it is interesting or has a curious meme around it or something. I don't even know the right way to put it.
I actually think the biggest reason why it grows is price goes up. Yeah, I think that's the biggest reason why it grows.
Yeah, greed and opportunity.
Yeah, which actually kind of brings about if we stay in the religious analogies here, that brings about maybe a Calvinist dilemma, because the proof of your spiritual worth is shown in your real world standings. And I think according to most people's judgments, BTC has won that one very handily so far. So I can get why people have that perspective. But when in what you just shared about the missionary work, there were a few things that I find really interesting. So number one, the time frame. That it might be that it's still the phase of, hey, there is this tech, but it's not now, but we're on the way there. So that would ask that's more about informing people. There is the second element of somebody still needs to develop then those solutions that they can actually use at some point in time in their accounting firm. And that's a lot of work. And I think this brings me then to something like delayed gratification, but in a real way, where it's not just buy something and then sit on it, but it's like work. And you don't know if you're going to have any result from it ever. But it's the only thing you can do.
Absolutely. Well, and that's why, I mean, some missionary work looks like, okay, we're going to make a decade-long commitment to bringing in piping, and we're going to teach these people how to farm. And it's funny, you show up in a place and you realize they don't even use basic crop rotation techniques. And it's like, aren't you an agrarian society here? And we're just kind of foragers, and it's groups of families that just keep their own gardens, and they're not particularly efficient, and they don't have clean water and some of these things. It's like, okay, guys, what, like, this is going to take some time, and we're going to have to raise some money. We're going to come back a number of times over the next few years, but we're going to give you basic irrigation, clean water so you can drink and shower. And by the way, if you treat your crops this way, if you systematize them, you get more yield and whatever else. And then you realize by the end of the period, like, oh, okay, everybody's a lot more a lot more everything, frankly. Like they have freed up all kinds of time to do other things that matter to them. And then it makes them much more open to your other ideas, right? And that's the real beauty of it. That's why something like Christianity spread across the world like wildfire, because a lot of it, even if you don't believe in God, you can still take the practicality of, oh, here's all these rules that make for a good society, and things like, don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, don't kill are principles that a lot of us can get behind. And then even some of the broader principles about just like authenticity and the value of family and those things obviously have very clear spillover benefits and things. And so even people pretending to be Christians has a tendency to make the society better to a point. Of course, you have the opposite effect of people that start cults or get into power and use it as a way to, just extract stuff from people as well. So, I mean, it's not like everything's flawless, just like in Bitcoin, but
And so maybe to bring the analogy kind of to a close, as we're also heading towards the end of this call, maybe in the Bitcoin example, the missionaries are the entrepreneurs. And what actually Bitcoin needs right now is not many more people to join the Bitcoin Association or something like that, but people to create genuine solutions for stuff that aren't thinking in the we're going to take over the Catholic Church scale, but that are thinking about how do we sanitize water? How do we make better plumbing? How do we have better gardens? And that to prove the worth there to people who are not interested in Bitcoin, but who are interested in having a better life.
Yeah. It's the easier sell, which goes back to me saying we need people that just want to do real business development. There's a multi-trillion-dollar business opportunity here, and almost nobody's touching it. So that's indicative of all kinds of madness, in my opinion.
Yeah. So maybe we close it with that end of the analogy. Thank you very much, Kurt, for this conversation.
Beautiful. It's always a pleasure, Lucas.
You never know what's around.